You'll be able to see the slides from there. Okay. So thank you all very much. It's a great pleasure to be here in Aligarh. I can't believe it has taken me so many years to come here. I'm right here in Delhi. I'm ashamed to say that this is my first visit to Aligarh. Professor Irfan Habib, it's a great pleasure to be able to present my work to you today and to make your acquaintance. Thank you very much, Professor Ali Nadeem Razavi and Professor Shireen Musbi, for the invitation to be here today. I've been reading the work of M. Athar since I too was a student, and from what I have read, I honestly don't feel that I can offer a more appropriate tribute to him other than this close reading of a text called the Chandayan. The reason is because the Chandayan is a tale of Hindu-Muslim confluence. It is a tale not of a court, but of the people. It is a tale that allowed one community to get to know another, and it was a tale that was written down in manuscripts probably as early as the end of the Tughlaq period, but certainly during the reign of the Lodhis, although not in Delhi, but in many of the other sultanates that were around at that time. My own involvement with this text began sometime towards the end of the 1990s, while I was employed as a tutor at SOAS, and I was teaching some of the MA classes over there. And one of the students I was supervising decided to write a dissertation on this subject, and that allowed me to start inspecting the manuscripts very closely, and I benefited enormously from two gentlemen who opened up their slide archive for me. One was Robert Skelton, who had a vast knowledge of manuscripts that were kept in European and Indian collections, and the other person was somebody by the name of Simon Digby, who held the same position and office that I did at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and he was very helpful to me in developing a course on Sultanate manuscripts and paintings when I joined JNU. Both of them really put me on the path to be able to access certain important manuscripts that were lying unpublished. And I managed to photograph them in various collections in the West and then in India. And over the years, I began to deliver many lectures on the Chandayan all over the world. And every time I tried to correct the mistakes that I was making, but the lectures became more and more popular, and they started getting broadcast and published, even though it was written with mistakes. Such was the power of the story of the Chandayan, not of my recounting, but of the power of the story itself. So when an opportunity presented itself, when I became the editor of Man, to be able to correct my mistakes and hopefully offer you a version which is slightly better, I had the opportunity to be able to collaborate with three other scholars. Kamar Adamji had by that time finished a PhD on the Chandayan paintings at NYU, working with Barry Flood. Vivek Gupta had been working on the calligraphy of Sultanate period Bihari Nastalik in India. And we had the work of Richard Cohen, who is the main author, the main translator, who had been working for decades on translating the entire Chandayan into English. Now, what is the Chandayan? The Chandayan was a folk epic that was very popular in Chhattisgarh, Bundelkhand, Jaunpur, and that entire region of Allahabad and the areas around it during the early to later medieval period. But there are versions of the Chandayan story which are also to be found in Santhali, and in various other regional dialects, not just in the Jaunpuri, Eastern UP version of Hindi. The story became quite popular between 1370s till about the 1520s. So there's a 150-year time span when it became extremely popular in different Sultanate courts of North India. And this story is a very unusual one. So before I proceed any further, I think I should, for the benefit of those of you who don't know the story, I should first tell you what the story itself is, and then I will try and analyze this story for you. What I'll do in the first part of my talk today is to introduce you to the broad parameters of what the book that I'm presenting to your library is about. And in the second part of my talk, I will do a deconstruction of the importance, the historical relevance of this story from the perspective of my own contribution to this book and what I have written in this book, my chapter in this book, which is about a history of the Chandayan. So my talk is divided into two parts. The story itself is a rather racy, ribald story, very unusually racy romance. It's a story which begins with the birth of a beautiful girl called Chanda, as beautiful as the moon, who's born in the family of Rao Meher Sehdev. And on the 6th day after she is born, the astrologers are called to the house to prepare her horoscope. And the verse says, after 5 days came the 6th night, the night of feast day, for the Chhati ceremony. Invitations were sent out to all 36 castes residing in Gomer. So 36, the Chhattis is usually a reference to the Chhattis Rajputs. So all 36 families of Rajputs were invited for the feast. From every house greetings poured in, drums of joy were played. More than 7,000 ladies came for the feast, their face, hands and feet decorated with altar or vermilion. Brahmins sat assembled, poring over manuals, figuring out Chanda's horoscope. It is written on her forehead that she will come to death's door at the supreme moment of life. Fire surrounds Chanda, yet she will not be burnt. As moths are prone to light, kings will come to her but die. Right? That was the verse that the poet gives us as the horoscope that is made for her as soon as she is born. Similarly, a boy is born in the neighboring town to the Rao Sahab's family, and his name is Bavan. At the age of 4, a rishta comes from Bavan's family to Chanda's family for her hand in marriage, and even though the horoscopes of the two children don't match, Bavan's family is extremely persuasive and manages to convince Rao Meher Sehdev to the marriage, agree to the marriage. At 16, the Gauna takes place and she is sent off to her husband's home, where horror and shock, she is deeply wounded because she discovers that he's not very nice to look at, he's one-eyed, and he turns out to also be impotent. So after a year of an unconsummated marriage, please note, the poet is very keen to let us know that the marriage is not consummated. She appeals to her mother-in-law and asks her what's to be done. Her mother-in-law tells her that, listen, some boys are late bloomers, it's alright. Bhavan has not yet attained sexual maturity, but he will. To be patient. Chanda, however, is exceptionally beautiful. She is the kind of girl about whom she is a legendary beauty, and she is getting wasted while her beauty is being wasted while living in her in-laws and her husband's home. And so one day, at the pretext of getting water from the well with the other girls, she decides to run away from there and carry on going to her father's home. She is welcomed back into her father's home, but after a few weeks, her father doesn't know what to do because she is technically a married woman and her husband should be taking care of her. But at any rate, she is still welcome to stay in her father's home and she refuses to go back to her in-laws. So to protect her, her father locks her up in the first floor of the house, and all day long Chanda has nothing to do except sit on the balcony and look at the world going by. And she is rather like Juliet sitting on that balcony till one day there is a bard, a walking minstrel, who is going past the house, who sees this ravishing beauty on the balcony, and he can't resist himself and he starts singing songs about her beauty, and this man goes wandering and he ends up in the town of a place called, in the town which is run by a man called Rupchand. On a hot summer night, Bajir, the singing bard, is singing a Baramasa, and he is singing a Sarapa or a Naksik Varnan, as we call it in Sanskrit, where he is describing the beauty of this girl from head to toe. And it's a standard way of Hindi poetry as well as in Persian poetry that you start with either the head of the woman and you carry on describing her body. You go to her forehead, her eyebrows, her eyes are like this, her nose is like that, her mouth is like this, and you carry on to her breasts, her stomach, her navel, her legs, her toes. You reach finally and you sing these songs describing the girl's body. So when Rupchand hears this song on a hot summer night, he's convinced that this poet who is singing this song is not making up some standard song and he's not singing fiction. He's actually seen a woman who looks like this because his description is too vivid. So he sends his soldiers to capture the bard, and the bard is brought before the Rao, and the Rao beats him up and asks him till he tells him, who is this girl that you have seen who looks like this, because I must possess this woman wherever she is. And he lets him know that it is Rao Meher Sahadev's daughter. The next thing you know is that Rupchand has collected a small army and has marched upon the town of Govar to capture Chanda. Meher Sahadev does not know what to do. He doesn't have an army that can defend himself or his daughter. And his advisors tell him that there is a mercenary who lives nearby by the name of Lorik. And now enters the hero of our story called Lorik. And Lorik is asked to come and fight on behalf of Meher Sahadev. And he wins the battle and Chanda's honor is protected. A similar thing happens a few weeks later when word reaches the house, the husband's family, that other men are now coming to claim this girl. Surely Bhavan should do something about getting his own wife back home. At which point Bhavan's army is also dismissed by Lorik. And second time when Lorik is coming back after being victorious and having defended Chanda's honor once more, as he is marching back into the city, his howdah of his elephant is at the same height as her first floor balcony, and their eyes meet and romance starts. And now Chanda faints looking at this wonderful, virile, strong man who is in every way the antithesis of her husband. In every way, he is the very opposite. He is defended her honor. All these other men have been beaten up. Now, how are the two to meet? Because even Lorik is a married man. He's married to a woman called Mena. And Chanda is still married technically to Baban. And how will this affair blossom? Now comes her Kaniz, her confidant, comes to her rescue, a woman by the name of Biraspat, or in some texts Biraspati, if you prefer. But the local Jaunpuri version is Biraspat. Biraspat says that she must, if this man truly loves her, he will, in order for them to meet first, she tells Rao Mahar Sahadev that you should host a party. This man has rescued your daughter, saved her honor time and again. Itna to banta hai, as it were, you must throw a party in his honor. And Chanda gets excited at the proposal because now as the daughter of the house, she will have to serve everyone who comes to thank them. And while she is doing that, she'll get an opportunity to talk to Lorik. And so this grand party is organized and the two of them get a few moments together. And they are both convinced that they want to meet each other, but they don't know how. So now Biraspat is once again employed. And Biraspat advises Chanda that boys like this keep coming and going in your life. You better be sure if this man truly loves you, don't make it easy for this man to have you. So first let us get convinced if he really loves you, let me give him a test. So she gives him a test and she tells him that if you truly love this woman, prove it. And the test is that you have to live as a yogi outside at a temple. And here is a mala, and the only thing that you can japo on it is the name of Chanda. And you have to do the Chanda jap for however much time she stipulates, and then we'll see. And this man faithfully keeps doing that, and the girls get convinced that yeah, he truly loves her, otherwise he wouldn't be able to forsake his family and do all of this. So now that he has done this, now something has to happen. And so during the monsoon there is some excuse where every night the men of the village go to some festival, to some Jagarata. So he tells his wife that he's now become very religious. Not only has he been living as a yogi in a temple for all these months, he now also wishes to go to the Jagarata. And he makes this excuse of going to the Jagrata that he actually steals into Chanda's apartment, and there they make love, and their affair carries on for a full 21 days. And after this lunar cycle is over, this month comes to an end, the women of the village, of the town, have to meet at the local temple during the daytime publicly. And when they meet at the temple, when all the women gather at the temple, one look at Chanda and Mena realizes out of some kind of feminine intuition that this is the woman who is having an affair with my husband. And something happens to Mena at that moment and she can't contain herself and she publicly slaps Chanda. And Chanda starts taunting Mena and said, well, some women know how to keep a man and some women don't know how to keep a man, and I am one of those women who obviously is the right kind of woman for Lorik. And once she's declared the fact that she's having this affair publicly, Mena cannot contain herself and she beats her up to a point that she strips her naked at the temple. And there is this public fight that takes place, after which there is this scandal that has erupted. Now, the Rao Sahab, who is in charge of the village, cannot have different rules for his own family compared to what he has for the rest. And so the next thing that happens is that the two, Lorik and Chanda, have no alternative but to elope. Now in all great Indian epics, you have a elopement, you have a Aranyaka Parvan, the forest, the exile period, right? In the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, etc. There's this period of exile. So even in the Lord Chandra, in the Chandayan, the lovers escape. And over a year, many things happen to them over a year. Till finally they settle down in one place and they live as a married couple for some time. However, one day their blissful idyll is disturbed because a traveler comes from his native village and recounts the horrible condition of his mother and his wife and what they are going through, uncared for at home. And he suddenly feels guilty. But he doesn't have the guts to go back home because he knows he will not be accepted. So he camps outside his village with the Gwalas, the Ahir community to which he actually belongs, outside his village, and he sends malas and baskets of flowers and garlands to all the people in the village as a peace offering, in the town as a peace offering. When a basket of flowers arrives at his wife's door, she is most surprised because she says for the past year and a half, 2 years, nobody in the town has cared for her and even thought of her once. Now suddenly somebody is sending her a basket of flowers and she's most disbelieving of this situation, and so she quizzes the man who has brought the delivery, the courier, and she asks him, reveal to me who is the person who has sent these, because she thinks it's her husband. And he doesn't divulge, but he says that there is a camp of some strange new people outside the town. Why don't you go and check it out? So she goes there and she inspects it, and there she finds, while she is walking there, she has her gungat down. Lorik recognizes her. And rather like Ram, he decides to test her fidelity by making a pass at her. And Chanda refuses to respond, and she says that she is a well-married woman who is not going to take advances by any old man who comes along, just because her husband isn't in town. So Chanda comes across as being extremely virtuous, and soon after she has another encounter, Meena comes across as being extremely virtuous, and has another encounter with Chanda, where once again the two women have a horrible fight and Lorik has to intervene.
Women have mercy.
Yes. Now, this violence has to be stopped, some resolution is required, and one resolution that we are told is that our hero, Lorik, condescends to cohabit with his wife, provided she accepts Chanda as the junior wife, standard operating procedure of old, and so she agrees, and so now he marries Chanda publicly, and we are told that this is a happy ever after situation because he gets to live at home with mummy, with wife, and junior wife. Right? He's got all three in his life as he had always wanted. And it's a perfect ending. But then the poet tells us that actually men like this are never really satisfied and they never reach tranquility and peace. They are seekers. And we don't know what happened to Lorik in the end, but the last we heard was that he was wandering the ghats of Banaras, still seeking. Right? And so that's one ending that we are told for the story. Now, this story, the important thing is, this story was picked up by a man we popularly call Mullah Dawood, but Badayuni tells us that he was a Maulana, and it's better to refer him as Maulana Dawood instead. Dawood lived in the time of Khane-Jahan Jona Khan at the village, at the town of Dalmal, not far from Allahabad. And in the 1370s, he was one of the great murids of Chirag-e-Delhi. He picked up this story and began to recite it every Thursday night, and it would take him 52 episodes to be able to tell this entire story in his weekly recitations. And this racy story was such that the audience would come back every week to listen to the next installment of the story. But think about it, it's a rather awkward story for a man to be reciting from a pulpit. It's a story at the heart of which is an illicit love affair, which is adulterous in nature. Not the kind of love affair that the ulama would approve of. How much could the Sufis get away with in UP at that time, or in Delhi at that time? And how could such a story become acceptable and become so popular for that 150-year period? But Dayuni also says something else which is quite interesting. He says that this story used to be very popular, but nowadays, i.e. in the reign of Akbar, it's hardly heard any longer. That's also rather interesting. So our character Daud, the author, or should we really call him the editor, was a rather interesting person who took a piece of popular folklore, penned it, gave it a fixed rhythm and meter and language and wrote it down, and turned it into a classical text for courtly literature, because there are 5 beautiful illustrated manuscripts that have come to us from the period of about the late 1400s to early 1500s. And these 5 illustrated manuscripts are amongst the most critical evidence for pre-Mughal painting that survives from South Asia. And by far the most important manuscripts for Sultanate period painting that have come to us, because the corpus of paintings, and in the book that you will have with you in the library, we've managed to publish 530 Chandayan paintings. So to have a corpus of 530 Sultanate period paintings all about one story, albeit divided into 5 manuscripts, can tell us what a large and popular set of Chandayan manuscripts must have been there at that time. Now they are all stylistically dated. We've never found a colophon for even one of the manuscripts. And they're all, as I said, they can be dated somewhere between 1475 to 1525. That's the broad period, that 50-year time span when we can put these manuscripts. The manuscripts are art historically important also because they comprise a whole bunch of these rather wonderful motifs. And if you isolate these motifs and look at them separately, as we art historians are wont to do, you'll find that they are all motifs that occur in Akbar's Hamzanama. And for anyone who is a student of Mughal painting, we are quite aware that the first great major Mughal painting project that put the entire Kitab Khana, the studio, the atelier of the Mughal studio together, which commandeered painters from all over Hindustan to come and work at Agra for Akbar, was of course the Hamzanama manuscript, which contained about 1400 paintings once upon a time. But where did those painters who came to work in the Mughal studio come from? On the Perso-Arabic script. It's not easy to figure out even a single word that is written in that text. But there was one manuscript version that was written in Kaithi, which is a Nagari script. which was very fortuitous, which was found in Agra. And that helped as a kind of a cue to be able to understand the accent that was being used in the text. The odd thing is that the titles of each verse, each canto, have all been translated into Farsi. But the canto itself, shall I call it a chaupai in traditional language, right, is actually in Avdhi. Now, why would you put Persian translations of what the title for each verse is, but put the rest of the verse in a different language, which is the local language of UP? The reason is obvious. The book is being written for a person who is a native Persian speaker to be able to find the relevant verse as per the title, as an index, as the table of contents, to be able to get to the right verse quickly because he's a native Persian speaker. But for that native Persian speaker to be able to understand the language of the people that he is living amongst. To be able to then, when somebody is reciting the Chandayan in front of him, he can actually read, but without the accent marks. He can hear it, and he can listen to it, but he's found the title in Farsi on top. So you can get to the right page, and then your teacher, when they are reading out the Chandayan to you, reciting the story, you can actually follow it along. And so how these manuscripts are actually being used is something which is quite critical in telling us about the nature of the society at that time, at that very interesting moment between the 1470s and 1520s. What's going on? Why are these manuscripts being written the way they are, and why are they being illustrated the way they are? So that becomes another important historically significant aspect of this manuscript. I've forgotten various points which will come to me, and the slides will act as a kind of an aid memoir. So let me start showing you what these manuscripts look like. I'm going to race through some of these pictures because otherwise I'll run out of time. I've already mentioned all of these issues, so I won't. Yeah. One thing I should say, in studies on language, the Chandayan has been classified within a rather broad category called Apabhramsh literature. However, the poem itself is classified both as a Premakhyan as well as a Masnavi. It fulfills the category of being both. Right? Now, Apabhramsh is a word that literally refers to that which is corrupted in grammar. If your locus standi is refined Sanskrit, if you are viewing it from the position of refined Sanskrit, you will call such language as corrupted language or Apabhramsh language. However, many a North Indian text, all the way from the 8th to the 16th century, falls under the umbrella term of Apabhramsh literature, including various Hindu, Jain and Sultanate period texts. Parmeshwari Lal Gupta noted that when Mullah Daud fixed the text of this folk epic into the Chandayan, he recomposed it in a Masnavi style in the Hindari language. Most other authors, however, have conformed to the belief that the language of the manuscript should really be called Avdhi rather than Hindari, which is borne out by Richard Cohen's study of the mild linguistic shifts in register between Hindari and Avdhi in his essay in the book. I should also mention that there was another Chishti Sufi by the name of Abdul Quddus Gangohi, which some of you may know of. who lived between 1456 to 1537. Now, Gangohi is known to have translated the Chandayan into Farsi. So his was the next stage after Dawood, the next stage of the intervention in the text, contemporary with the illustrations of the manuscript, was the period of Gangohi. Gangohi would have been active at the time when the paintings would have been made, and his sphere of influence shifted from Rudauli in eastern UP northward towards Saharanpur and to Shahbaz near Ambala. And in fact, then descendants of Gangohi ended up in Ahmednagar, in Bijapur and in Ahmednagar, taking the Chishtiya sect down to the Dakkan. Now, I'm mentioning this to you because this is exactly the period when these manuscripts were being made. So the manuscripts' Persian titles might be the intervention of Gangohi's translation. And I think the fact that this manuscript is painted at multiple centers, all the 5 manuscripts happen to be in 5 different styles, which is fascinating. One is in the Western Indian Jain style, which might have been active in Mandu. Another one seems to be in a slightly Dakhni style, which could be either Mandu or Ahmednagar. A third one, which was found in the Budni Bazaar of Banaras and bought by Rai Krishnadas, might have been made, I believe, in Jaunpur. There is another one that is in a mixed Western Indian and North Indian style, which turned up rather bizarrely in a Buddhist monastery in Sikkim or Bhutan, somewhere there. And that might have been made somewhere in central India, perhaps Gwalior or something like that, or Jaunpur. And then there is one which is made in the so-called Chora Panchashika style, which we find in Palam and North India, and in this area, and going a little further north. And so that's the 5th one that has been found. I'll show you some paintings of all 5. One of the hardest things to do as a scholar is to make infographics for our students. And hats off to you, sir, for creating the Atlas of Mughal India, Professor Fanavi, because I had to produce a map of the languages and dialects that were being used in 14th to 15th century India for this particular book. And the kind of research that had to go into the production of a map, which seems to be so simple, but was filled with so many controversies on how to create such a map. So the map is in the book, and we've tried to distinguish between political zones of influence, major Sufi silsilas and archaeological sites, and overlaid it with 3 types of languages. Languages that had a literature, languages that were dialects, that could be heard, languages that had no script, but were languages nonetheless, that were in circulation between the 14th to the 15th centuries. In our focus area is the north of the Bahmani kingdom, and that map took us over a year to really put together. So just for your attention, it's only a page, but please do look at it. Okay. The Chandayan story, I should just let you know, exists also in Bhojpuri, Mirzapuri, Maithili, Chhattisgarhi, Santhali and Bhagalpuri dialects, apart from the Avdi Hindari word version that forms the focus of our main study. Now, Richard Cohen, as I said, has studied the actual language, and he's produced a canto for canto translation. Kamar Adamji and Vivek Gupta have studied the calligraphy and paintings. But I want to turn today to the discovery and the dating of this text and some very peculiar points about what was this monk doing in an Islamic Sufi context, right? Which is what I was going to talk about. Now the first of these manuscripts to be discovered is now divided between the Lahore and Chandigarh museums. They were all discovered pre-independence by Hafiz Muhammad Khan Sherani in the 1920s. And Sherani bought all 24 folios that came up for sale and he gave them to the Lahore Museum. At the time of independence, it was decided that half the collections of the Lahore Museum would be divided and would come to the Chandigarh Museum. Initially, they were kept in the Shimla Museum. When the Chandigarh Museum got constructed, the manuscripts were, 12 of the folios were shifted to the Chandigarh Museum. They are all in the Chaura Panchashika style, and the unique thing about this set of paintings is that on every painting, either on the top left or on the top right, in one corner, there is a painting of Mullah Dawood. Right? He is there on every single painted folio. Why? For those of you who are familiar with Hindi poetry, when you are reciting the poem, you always say Kahat Kabir and you carry on with the rest of the verse. You mention the name of the poet. And so there is a certain orality to the painting. The painting also has a certain recitation quality that is built into the way you would read the painting. Because you're not actually looking at a painting, you're actually listening to these paintings. Because these paintings are exactly canto for canto, the way the illustration is. So it is the words of Dawood that you are hearing per folio, per painting. And so the legitimacy that the text is getting because of a Maulana like Dawood is something which is being reinforced, lest you think that this is some funny Hindu romance with all kinds of wrong activities that are taking place and illicit love affairs and so on. No, there's Dawood on every page ratifying it, legitimizing it, right? So that's quite an interesting intervention on the painted page as well. So this is the one in the Chaura Panchashika style, and this is the one that is divided between Lahore and Chandigarh. Then there are the only 6 folios that were picked up by Rai Krishna Das that were found in the Guduri Bazaar of Banaras by him. And he bought them for 2 annas each. And it's quite interesting. The fact that they came up in the bazaar in Banaras, I think is indicative of the fact that they must have originally come from the Imperial Library in Jaunpur, and from the Shaki Library in Jaunpur. Who else's books would turn up in the Bazaar of Banaras? I think the provenance history is quite relevant. It's painted in very much what we call the Jain style. These large figures, and you might be able to notice that it's a thin line, very tense, thin line of painting, and the figures all have what is called the further projecting eye out of the profile. For those of you who are students of painting, will recognize that these are typical of Gwaliori and Mandul and Ahmedabad and Patan Jain style of painting of Western India, where it was a very popular phenomenon till about the 1450s. But I really don't think the painting is as early as the 1450s because it is painted on paper. And paper only starts really becoming popular in India after the 1450s. Really. I mean, for this level of manuscript. We do start getting paper for the Gwalior Quran in the 1370s and so on. But I think paper like this for painted illustrated manuscripts really doesn't start very much till about the mid-15th century. It's also in the vertical format, and the sizes of the figures have become larger. And these ideas tend to indicate a sort of a later 15th century or third quarter of the 15th century date. I don't think personally it would be earlier than that, although some scholars have felt that it could be as early as 1424 1425. I personally think it must be about 1475, but that's my opinion. Then there is a third manuscript which was picked up by a German traveler, and he found it in either Sikkim or Bhutan in a Buddhist monastery. It ended up in the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, and it has a very large number of paintings. It has 141 painted folios in this manuscript. This is also related to this Western Indian style. It also has these further projecting eyes. It also has the monochromatic red backgrounds. Then there is the fourth of the manuscripts, which is almost certainly painted for the Sultan of Mandu. And we know that because the palette changes, and we suddenly get a lot more influence from the Inju and Shiraz styles which are coming from Iran into the paintings of Mandu, which includes a pastel colored palette which comes in. So these pinks and pale greens, which are not there in Indian painting up until this date. And then the presence of arabesques and painted motifs in the background, and lots of tiny little decorative motifs and flourishes that come into the painting, which is very much a sign of Persian painting that comes into Indian traditions. And that happens in places like Mandu, and it's probably about the 1520s that we can date this to. If you connect it to manuscripts like the Nimatnama, which is one of the key manuscripts that you can associate this with. Now, this particular manuscript, just to let you know, came up for sale in Bhopal, and it was Ziauddin Ahmad Desai, who worked in the Persian Arabic Manuscripts Department of the ASI, who first studied this manuscript in 1954. Now, at the time, actually, it was not one, but there were two manuscripts that turned up in Bhopal, and there were many things that were coming out of the library at Bhopal, that were being, out of the Royal Library at Bhopal, that were being dispensed with in those days, in the 50s. Shortly after partition, things were quite rough at that time. And although privy purses had still not been withdrawn, a lot of the royal libraries had no alternate, and it was legitimate for them to sell. It wasn't illegal or something. For those of you who are wondering that how did these things come up for sale and so on, in those days it was perfectly legal. So these manuscripts came up for sale. A number of art dealers stepped in, and the best folios were taken abroad. And another group was offered to Moti Chandra, who used to be the director of what used to be called the Prince of Wales Museum of Bombay, now known as the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya of Mumbai, is where they are now available to see a large number of these manuscripts. So 70 odd folios ended up in Mumbai, and an equal number made their way into private collections. But what people didn't realize was that what was being sold off was actually coming from two manuscripts, not one. And they were not coming from the Chandayan only. There was a second manuscript. Now here hangs another little tale, a bit of detective work. The Lahore manuscript, which Shirani had collected in the 1920s, was the first of the Chandayans to ever be published. And it was studied by a scholar of Indian art by the name of Karl Khandanawala, who used to live in Bombay. And Karl Khandanawala gave it the name Lord Chanda, because the principal characters of the story were Lorak and Chanda. And that's the word that came to stick in all cataloguing internationally and in all art history circles. So whenever you and I normally talk about the book, and you read books I've written up until 5 years ago, it wasn't called the Chandayan. In all the books it's called the Lord Chanda story, the Lord Chanda manuscript. That's the old name for it. I mean the modern mistaken name for it, I should say, right? the Chandayans that they thought that for what was coming out in Bhopal was a Chandayan, but actually there were two books that were coming out of Bhopal, out of the Bhopal library. One was a Chandayan, the other was another book that is related and has 90% of the story is the same story, but it is a story called the Maina Sat. The protagonist now is not Chandayan, but it is his wife, Maina's son. And as a feminist, I got very excited because I said, oh wow, we have a version of the story called the Maina Sat. Let's read this because this will give us Maina's version of having been aggrieved, being discarded, her revenge, her point of view. You know, we have an opportunity to get a parallel perspective rather than Chanda's perspective, but boy was I wrong. The Maina Sat is an even more patriarchal text than the Chandayan is, because the Maina Sat is a text which goes page after page to tell us how virtuous and good, what a sati Maina was all through the period of her abandonment, and how she suffered at the hands of various men who saw her destitute condition, and yet she would not let any man take advantage of her and bribe her even with the money that she needed to be able to stay alive, because she was so poor when her husband had abandoned her that they had no money, her mother-in-law, and she didn't have food to eat, and even in that condition she remained Sat. So the Maina Sat angle was a very medieval patriarchal perspective of that work. Anyway, the Maina Sat was also an illustrated manuscript, and that was also lying in the Bhopal library, and that also came up for sale, but because the paintings look almost identical, they were mistaken to be Chandayan pages until we managed to read the back of each of them and discover that they are actually Chandayan, which were Maina Sats. The last of them is this extraordinary manuscript which is lying in the John Rylands Library in Manchester. Now, by the Sussex had purchased this manuscript, so we are talking very early in the East India Company's annexation or arrival in India, that this manuscript had made its way to Bernard Quaritch, the booksellers in London. And the Duke of Sussex's library eventually was bequeathed to the University of Manchester, and it became part of the John Rylands Public Library, where 240 painted folios of this Chandayan are kept. Now, it is the most beautiful and the most remarkable of the manuscripts, and it's either painted in Mandu or Ahmedabad. Those are the two views of scholars on this particular manuscript. These are paintings from the very similar Maina Sat. I'm going to skip over that. These are the 6 different styles of painting, and as I said over there, it's a story which can be studied from a gender perspective about ideal notions of masculinity and womanhood. It is a book which is about commerce and spirituality, and therefore it is quite revealing to use it as a document of history. That's the 2 women fighting at the temple. The scene that I told you about where the women go to pray, and down here you can see the 2 women are tearing each other's hair out and kicking each other and so on in front of the temple. The manuscript has I think we also, for a minute, what's worth thinking as students of history is who wants to listen to a soap opera like this? Right? Everyone, like, who is this story being written for? How do we use this as a document of history? What do I do with a piece of literature from the 15th century, from the 14th century? What does it tell me about the kind of audience? What is the kind of audience that empathizes with a hero like Lorik, who wants a heroine like a Maina or a Chanda, right? What is this kind of society? Who is this kind of man, Lorik, who is not an upper caste, who belongs to an Ahir community, who runs away with the daughter, who is a mercenary who can be hired by anyone who gives him money, whether it is one king one day, another king another day. It's at a time when he wants to impress the Rajputs, but he is not part of the Rajput community. Because 3/4 of the way of the story, till then he has been referring to himself as one of the Rajputs, but 3/4 of the way in the story, he finally reveals that he is an Ahir. So, what is this story about social mobility? And that he can run away with the daughter of a Rao? So, a character like Lorik, my chapter in the volume actually does a character analysis of these three main protagonists, Mena, Lorik, and Chandayan. The manuscript is interesting because it shows Lorik as a yogi, as a warrior, as a gambler. There he is, throwing dice on the game board, rather like a Yudhishthir who is gambling away his kingdom. And then there he is when he sees at one moment when Chanda is about to die because she's been bitten by a venomous snake. He is so distraught that our hero, who is normally so strong, starts tearing his hair out and beating his chest and does an atam outside the space where Chanda is dying. So it's a character analysis of these people to use them for history telling. Because the erotic paintings and the verses are coming as much from the Iranian tradition as much as they're coming from the Indian tradition. So there are erotic paintings, equally erotic and explicit paintings that were being made to illustrate the verses of Persian poets at this time for certain Masnavis. And so when it is being used in a Masnavi or in a Premakyan in India, it is satisfying the elite consumers of both traditions of poetry, whether it is the Indian poetic consumers or the Persian poetic consumers. So the verses are quite graphic. The bee entered the Rao's garden and took the nectar from the flower buds. Moving around from branch to branch, he picked up the grapes from the vine, playing with the fruit. He frolicked on the oranges and the limes, taking pleasure from them with teeth and tongue. He placed his nostrils on her navel, took in the fragrance of sandalwood paste and smeared it on his head. He took pleasure from the jasmine and white roses, all the flowers and fragrant plants. Chanda released the Rao's flowers and gave them to the bee. The bee thirstily took the ras, leaving the flowers drained. I am not saying this, Maulana Dawood is saying this to his public. Right? And I'm only reading out one verse to you. There are multiple. Right? And so, what I'm trying to get at is, how is this permissible? That's what we need to consider as to what is the nature of what was the ulama at that time doing in Mandu and in Jaunpur and how were they permitting this, right, to happen every Thursday from the pulpit? Not outside under the people tree in the chalk, right? This is happening from the pulpit, and that's what is quite an important set of things for us to remember about this manuscript. The other thing is, Lorik is a funny upper branch, I believe, of a Sanskrit word called Lolark, which is a word that comes up as early as the Skanda Puran. There is a kund in Banaras called the Lolark Kund. The heroine is called Chanda, the moon. It is the chase of the sun and the moon. Aided by whom? Biraspat, Jupiter. And Mena, the dark force, the dark bird, is his family that is hovering around in the background, making him do the right thing. And so it's a It's a cosmological text about Jyotish and all of these kinds of things. This cosmological metaphor, astrological metaphors are quite common in texts at this time. So if this is a love, an ishq which has been ordained by the sun, moon and stars, then who are you and I as mortals to doubt it? So the story ends up getting a certain legitimacy because of its cosmological metaphor that comes up again and again all through. It also is a great source for a student of history as a source of material culture. So for those, I would urge you to enjoy the paintings, because here for the first time we see in India the use of gunpowder coming in with cannon and muskets and cavalry. We see the coming in of tile work, which we know is imported from Bhutan and coming in from Iran and Afghanistan into the subcontinent. We see that outside the palace there is a lion on the ground, referring to the fact that that is where the Singhasan is, which is an ancient Indian idea of the lion's throne. We have vessel types that we know are becoming popular, and tile work on the floor, the turquoise sky blue tiles that you can see, referring clearly to the kind of tile work which is coming to India in the Sultanate period. We see riding boots and chainmail armor for the first time. So we know that chainmail armor, for those of you who have read Simon Digby's Horse and Elephant, would know that the coming of armor and things like this has come into the subcontinent, and we clearly see that in these paintings. But for students of architecture, you know that the great intervention in the history of Indian architecture post Firoz Shah Tughlaq or during Firoz Shah Tughlaq's reign is the incorporation of the chhajja into the building. And so all these paintings have domes but chhajjas as well, and the striped dome is a Lodi feature mostly. And so you get the Lodi melon or lobed dome with the chhajja, which has come in from Indian architectural tradition, represented in these paintings. But perhaps the most exciting verses for cantos, for a material culture historian, are things like this. When Lorik is invited for the party, we are given a detailed description of the things that have to be cooked and procured from the market for this feast. And when you see the paintings that accompany that, we know exactly what is being prepared and how it is being cooked and what are the kind of things, preparations that go on. So, one painting at the extreme left is all about the different kinds of large game, big game that is being hunted. The next painting is only about the different types of small game or fowl that is being gathered. The third painting is all about the different kinds of vegetables. The fourth painting that you are looking at is about the different kinds of rice and the different kinds of lentils. And then there is a painting which is about specifically telling us who has to make all the cutlery and how all the serving dishes have to be made from different kinds of leaves, and who is going to be in charge of making what. So it's a very detailed insight into the different castes and communities and their functions and what is going to be served at a rouse feast. There are also depictions of markets. But what I like are some of these verses. One of the traders' verses where he says, quote, Canto 370, this is, I am carrying wax, madder, chironji, betel nut, coconut, clove, camphor and dates. Molasses, fragrances, vermilion, bay leaf and pennywort in vast quantities. I have embroidered silk sarees, all kinds of leather and thousands of birds of ornaments. Diamonds, collar, plenty of copper, silver, khas, sandalwood, agaru, fill up the caravan. I am a Brahmin from Govar, Surjan is my name, and I am going away to Haldi Pathar. Now this is a Brahmin trader from this town of Govar, and it's telling us what his supplies are. And here is a scene of the market in which he's going to sell these things. Another lovely verse is about the wardrobe of our character Chanda, where she says she wears a red tasseled sari, jugiya, a chokariya and other saris. She wraps a fine lungiya sari around herself. She also wears a mandala and a chundari. In the month of Sawan, Chanda wears saffron colors. She wears a printed Gujarati sari which befits her, where in eastern UP. She is not in favor of wearing striped clothes. In all clothing she is partial to silk. The Doriya, Chandrot, Ajuru and Patola saris enhance her appearance. Where is she getting the Patola? In UP. She appears to wear a chunari, partly dyed cloth made in the Chola country. So much for our, reflection of internal trade in terms of the textiles that she wishes to consume and she has in her wardrobe as a princess in the language of the poet at that time. So I find there are other clues, like this is a painting of the interior of her bed chamber, and we are told that she had the Ramayana painted inside her bedroom and on the murals. Now, no murals have actually survived from the 1400s from UP area, and so it's quite interesting to be able to see what the painters would have been trained in, because you have a depiction of that. There are other such clues, like for instance, there are detailed enumeration of the different castes and communities that live in this town and the social segregation that is followed. The festivals that they perform. Now the method of communicating this relies on an older form of visual communication using the language of gestures or mudras. And for those of you who are interested in know the history of Indian sculpture, will easily be able to see the continuity that is coming from the world of sculpture into the world of manuscript painting. Perhaps the best example of this is the moment when Chanda goes to the temple. Now she is supposed to be without a husband, living alone in her father's balcony locked up. Yet when she goes to the temple with a thali in her hand, she turns into this beautiful Nayaka, pulling the thorn out from her foot. That's the same Nayaka that you find on the temples of Khajuraho. That's the same Nayaka that you find in the Abhigyana Shakuntala, when Shakuntala has to pull the thorn out from her foot to catch a glimpse of Dushyant looking back over her shoulder. So these are older conventions of poetry, like the Baramasa, the Naksik Varnan, the Chopai format, the Nayaka Ved, which are being drawn into Sultanate period poetics, not very different from what was happening in the same period in another book like the Suleiman Charitra, which was happening right here in Ayodhya itself. So, Kalyanamala's text. So you have other Sultanate books that are drawing on similar ideas at this time and creating a confluence of cultures. So it is what I call a genre of literature that deliberately bridges communities in the purport of what these manuscripts are doing. I'm going to race through because I've reached the end of my time, but I would like to pause and wonder on one aspect: how comfortable could it have been to have manuscripts that actually, even if you're trying to bridge two communities, to actually have manuscripts that talk about worshipping in a temple or becoming a yogi and living in a temple. Like he could have been given a tasbih and be sitting outside like a Sufi sheikh, he could be sitting there reciting. But why is he actually sitting how is he still being maintained as living in a temple context and still holding on to his past identity? And then in the manuscripts, when this battle takes the fight takes place between the girls, between the women, looking into the paintings of the temple, we see something quite curious. In all the paintings, rarely is there a painting in which you can identify the deity inside the temple. It is a generic Indian blue god who could be any Indian god, or it is a most monstrous god who has so many heads: bovine, elephant, equine, deer, you name it. Like it's got every species, bird, and it's just there's heads shooting out from all directions, totally unidentifiable. And I think that's deliberate. They want to give the idea that it is a temple and it is a Hindu deity, but they don't want you to have darshan of the deity in the manuscript. They don't want to turn it into a Hindu religious manuscript. Right? So it's not an identifiable deity except in one manuscript, which is the Lahore Chandigarh one, where the deity in the temple is clearly Shiv. And it is a Shivling that is shown. But there's a really fun episode over here. The fight between the girls was so bad that the god who was living in the temple got up and ran out of the Garbhagriha and escaped from the shrine because he couldn't witness this fight between the women any longer. And so here we have Shiv with his trident and that nameless, formless deity on some animal leaving the temple. And here is the little anodyne blue god running away from the temple because he can't bear to see the girls fighting so much. Okay. So I think there is humor and there is sufficient irreverence and insouciance in the manuscript, not to one, but to all. And that's an old dictum that secularists have known, that don't cause offense to one, but sufficiently cause offense to all. And that usually allows you to get away with a lot. And so I think that is a formula that Daud and his peers had probably found. And I think that makes it quite appropriate to talk about over here. So in conclusion, simply, I'll say, I'll read it out. This law was important for the self-definition of communities that sang it. What was those natures of identities in a Sufi landscape for about 200 years, when this otherwise oral epic of a largely non-literate tradition was popularized at Sufi shrines? We must ask if it tells us as much about their conversion to Islam as it does about the capaciousness, or the capacity rather, of the early defining years of Indian Islam. An Islam that contains references to auguries and horoscopes, to yogis and temples, to periods of rituals and religious festivals, one that does not punish a pair of lovers for adultery, but resolves their affair because of the overarching celebration of Ishq. Quite simply, Sufism here accommodates the varieties of existing communities into a Muslim environment. By invoking repeatedly the Ahirs and the 36 clans of Rajputs who feature in this epic, this includes them and their religions and cultural habits into the Sufi fold at a historically important moment when the Khansawa community of Muslim Rajputs was increasing in North India and the Deccan. A warrior like Lorik emerges as a historical archetype, a protagonist, who captures the audience's attention because of how he echoes the circumstances of that time. Ours is, therefore, a multi-story epic. But ours is also a great piece of literature. And the conceit of the poet, in his awareness of what is the power of art, is something that I will leave you with at the end. Which is just this one verse. So there is, as you all know, in the great Indian classification of ras, Shringar, or the erotic sentiment, can be experienced in Sanyog or Sambhog and Vipralam. Vipralam is when you are separated from your lover. And when you're separated from your lover, your desire and longing gets even stronger. And it is in that moment when Chanda is completely tormented one night and she says to Biraspat, that Biraspat, tell me a story, some kind of story, tell me a story of love, as it says over there. So so that through its ras I can forget the emptiness of my spirit, so that I can light the lamp of ras in my heart. Fill me up with the nourishment of ras. The fire of separation cannot be slaked without ras. I have tasted many elixirs in my life, but now tell me a story that will distract me and that will fill me up with ras. Ras will help me pass the whole night. I'll get some peace. I'll get some peace. Please tell me such a story. And Viraspat replies to her, you stupid, innocent girl. What do you know, you naive girl, about ras? What do you know about the difference between art and reality? If I tell you a story that is so full of ras, you will imagine that that is reality, and you will imagine that art has transported you into a parallel world, and you will never be able to get past the trauma of the art. And I'll have to then do something to get you out of that. So there's no point in giving you a great story. Now this is a wonderful intervention in the story itself that the poet makes, because the poet is aware of the power of his poetry. And I think that is what Dawood is revealing to us also, about what stories like this can do to the public. So I leave you with that idea of how we can use such stories as stories of history telling. Thank you all very much for